Hey everyone, it's Green Thread. As usual, your host, Allie.
And Alexis.
And we're here virtually today, but as part of our time being distance-wise pretty far apart, this is kind of our best middle ground that we could put together. But it doesn't take away from the fact that we have some cool topics to talk about. And to get into that, I wanted to ask, did you know that the fate of the poison dart frog in the Amazon rainforest is intricately linked to the decisions made by farmers hundreds of miles away?
By farmers?
Yeah, whenever farmers decide to use pesticides to get rid of insects, it intricately or irreversibly impacts poison dart frog populations because they're killing off the prey for that specific species of frog.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. I never would have imagined. This is why we do what we do. Like everything big, small, close, far away, everything is all connected and has some type of impact on each other. So,
It does. But it's wild to think that maybe this farmer grows corn, but 200 miles to their west is a species that relies on the prey source or the food source from insects that they're wanting to get rid of because it impacts their crop. So I'm like, I don't know. That's a very complicated link, but it's
mhm.
crazy how close um, it is to their nearby biodiversity and wildlife populations.
Definitely. So, I mean, let's hop right into it. There's such a delicate connection. I don't even it's just such a delicate thing that the relationship between humans and wildlife and what like what's too much for us, what's too much for them, how do we keep that balance kind of.
Yeah, because technically the definition of our topic is for today, which is human dimensions and wildlife conservation. But human dimensions is a field of study that uses social science to understand how people relate to the environment, which is a super umbrella term for basically how can we communicate better to make sure that we're providing more sustainable practices and better equitable methods when it comes to natural resource management. But I really like this topic because I myself, I guess, want to be a researcher when it comes to human dimensions. I don't know much about how this is going to impact my career choice, considering I really like animals and that's the main focus of what I want to do. But when I was going to apply for grad schools, there was one particular professor who started a lab about human dimensions and human wildlife conflicts, and it just made me so excited because there was actually a word, which is a word for everything, but there was a word to describe a relationship between like people and animals that wasn't just necessarily conservation, because that's a very another umbrella term. But when I was looking up other studies, because it's one of those umbrella terms that does have a lot of research about it already, there was a particular article that caught my eye from Manfredo et al. And it was talking about how human dimension investigations are mainly used to minimize conflicts between recreationists and wildlife. So, whenever you're going to a park or whenever you're participating in any outdoor recreation activity, there is always some sort of regulatory or environmental framework that's going on to make sure that you have a, I guess, better time in the environment, but also so that you're able to take advantage of those resources.
Absolutely. And like I had said towards the beginning, there's such a delicate relationship between humans and wildlife, and just it's so crucial that we have things like that in place and that we think about those different dimensions of us versus, or not even versus, because that's almost like a hostile or negative way to put it. It's not necessarily humans versus the environment. It's more, okay, how can we work with them? How can we work with wildlife to still help ourselves, but not to infringe on the wildlife itself? And that's so important. And I feel like, that balance can get really thrown off really quickly. Humans have caused so many problems with wildlife and just the human impact on everything. And because we cause the problems, it's also our job to fix them because there's no way, humans coming in with their human problems are a little bit impossible for wildlife to solve on its own. So it is our duty almost to uh, help them solve that.
Yeah, because there's so many questions when it comes to how do these relationships impact wildlife, but also how do they impact humans, and how does that connection go to other organisms that aren't of the specific focal point of the study? And it's a very broad, and like you said, a very broad and complex area, especially when it comes to conservation efforts and natural resource management. Apparently, it's a very like common term to describe a specific set of broad questions, particularly what human behaviors lead to undesirable impacts on wildlife, and also what wildlife interactions provide positive and desirable responses. So basically, all that to say, how can we live and coexist, which we'll talk about coexistence later, but how can we coexist peacefully within our natural environment? And most of that's really, really important, especially now because it's just becoming more increasingly frequent that we're having human wildlife interactions, whether that be because of climate change, whether that be just other anthropogenic stressors, or just genuinely like areas in which specific species once inhabited is now overlapping too much with their like nearby human neighbors. And I mean, we're seeing more and more deer around new subdivisions, and just like it's almost like we are warping into a world that we already knew existed but is now like right outside our back door. So it's becoming a increasingly more desirable but also a more important topic to understand, so that we make sure that we're being cautious when it comes to where these like blurred gray lines come out, so that we're not like crossing them in a negative way.
Yeah, definitely. And that plays a big role. I like how you said it's kind of like overlapping in the way that it's kind of in our backyard because the more that humans develop and the more that our population grows, we're just going to keep on pushing that boundary of the backyard, and wildlife is going to keep pushing back. And it's this almost tug of war of, okay, when is it my backyard? When is it theirs? When is it ours? And how can we protect that? How can we learn about that? How can we make this a better situation for everyone? And that's why like just being involved in conservation and especially just on a very local scale and just on a community scale is really, really important because wildlife is so diverse. I mean, biodiversity is so important wherever you live in the world. So if you can hone in on, okay, what is my special organism in my area? What is my native organism? Who is my friend here, my buddy, my neighbor that I should be protecting and conserving?
Exactly, because at the end of the day, there's always going to be a risk with coexistence with organisms, just because, you got to find that ethical line. And we've talked about this prior with like animal testing. There's just other areas of conservation and just environmentalism in general that really pertain into the ethics behind a decision, whether it be like cutting down a certain acre of forest just because they want to divest more money into infrastructure, or whether or not like this specific area of, I don't know, an environment or habitat is starting to deconstruct. So like it's honestly out of the safety of nearby buildings to, tear it down or cause some other sort of reconstruction on top of it. But it all just, goes down to that risk of like, what can we do to protect those environments? And in one of the studies that I found, which was this was wild, it said that 71% of 250 papers, which is roughly 177 papers, focus on human wildlife conflict, while 8%, which is only 20 papers, focus on like neutral interactions or community-based conservation efforts between wildlife and humans, which can really signify that there's not a lot of like it's all about human conflict versus like how can we find resolutions to this issue and perhaps find alternate methods that are more sustainable or just all all around better. But that was really wild to find that because they were talking about like coexistence in specific, with talking about like there's coexistence does not imply that there is no risk. It just focuses on the tolerance of those risks. And that's a really good point because in order for us to figure out from like what point that we're focusing on ethics rather than just like the preservation of our resources, but it's like how much of that can we actually divest into this without it becoming harder on humans, which at the end of the day, everybody cares more about humans than animals, apparently.
Yeah, I've said it before and I'll say it again. We are in the Anthropocene. We are in the age of humans. Everything is centered around humans, our development, our technology, just it's all centered around humans. And that's why conservation work for animals is so important and wildlife and plants, flora, fauna, everything. It's all so important. Um, I'm kind of thinking back earlier to where you were talking about our needs kind of overlapping. And I was thinking about the different dynamics of that, especially with farmers, as you had mentioned also in your fun fact earlier in the episode. Uh, with farming, I feel like that is such a prime example of how that balance is so delicate because of they plant their crops for human consumption and maybe they need to use pesticides, maybe they need to use insecticides to keep these crops healthy, but at the same time there are animals out there that may come and do a crop raid like an elephant or something, things like that. So it's just it's so interesting and with livestock too, not even just farming crops, but if you have a ranch or own cattle, then the livestock aspect, we're using livestock for meat, for dairy products. We have chickens for eggs, and there are animals out there who may like to also eat these animals, any carnivores out in the wild, or even foxes preying on chickens. I've heard that many times living in Georgia, people getting their chickens eaten by foxes. Um, so yeah, it's definitely such a tough thing to be on, and I don't even necessarily think it's, like a debate because like I said earlier, versus is kind of a strong word, but it's okay, how can we integrate this a little bit better, you know?
Exactly. And it's not even like just about like human like the you're talking about pesticides, insecticides towards like directly towards nature because like the runoff and everything else excess from that, but it's also like human to human. So like say a farmer bought an acre of land that was technically once owned by an indigenous tribe, or like it goes into like a more ethnic side of things or side of demographics, and now they're like just raking it up and using really harmful methods of agriculture where you know something such a cultural like heaviness once was. And I think that's why I was like, oh, okay, so let's talk about human wildlife conflict, but then is it really just human wildlife, or is it human to human and wildlife? Like, is there other aspects that are almost like as intricate and as important as just directly from one to the other that can almost like close up that gap that we're trying to talk about in terms of like areas in which other methods that we use nature for are being like overexploited or whatnot. However, there is an actual like uh, word for that. As I always say, there's one for everything, but it's called community-based conservation, or CBC for short. But it's a method of environmental management and care of natural resources that takes into like ethnicity and local communities into that. Which particularly one article was trying to compare the like regulatory framework around how local communities, or LCs as short, versus Indigenous people, or IPs, have on natural resource management, and just how their cultural knowledge plays a big part. Because a lot of times we do have to kind of like play into the field of, do say you lived in California and you're on like an advisory board that wants to regulate or oversee an like agriculture, or even just like a specific acreage of wildlife in Oregon, like completely different geographic terrain there. And like, would the local communities of either of those places know more about the, management tactics they could use, or is somebody else that's like higher up on the CEO list know more? Like, I guess it just matters of, maybe local communities bring this into like a people-centered aspect, so then they'll know more about their local terrain than others might. I don't know.
Yeah, and local communities, I would say your own community kind of, more about your area. Let's say, I live in a certain town in Georgia, and I would say that I know more about living here after living here my whole life versus someone who lives in Atlanta, in the capital. It's drastically different, and I think that I would know more about just the way that the people function here, about the way that even the wildlife is here just from living here for so long. Um, so yeah, that collaboration is super, super important. Uh, because I wouldn't go somewhere and be like, yeah, I know more than you about this, even though you've been here much longer than me. I wouldn't want to do that to somebody. So I think the collaboration between scientists and local communities, the people of a community, is so crucial because the scientists can bring the education, they can bring their prior knowledge and experience to the table and say, hey, this is what I think you should do. And if there's any type of issue or pushback, or if it's like, oh, well, this is kind of what we see in our wildlife here. So I don't know what you've studied, but this is what we see. And that can even bring more valuable research and experience for the scientist, but also can turn around and educate the community about their own wildlife. So it's a great collaboration and a great cycle of learning and experiencing new things while protecting your local biodiversity.
Exactly. And even going off of that, like, say a scientist did find something out about like an endangered species of bird that lived in like North Georgia, and the local DNR was like talking about how they had some efforts to try and like preserve that species in that specific geographic region. And so the scientists and the DNR specialties can like work together to kind of like find out better tactics to use, but also it can be like, I don't want to say encouragement, but also like it does entice people to be more involved with like local efforts of preservation. So like, say they wanted to use like eBird as a way to kind of track that bird's movement across like a couple counties, and maybe the scientists could bring in that like aspect of, let's all get together and just go on like a mass bird hike and just like find out where they're going, and then they could use that for data, and then in turn conservation efforts. And that's kind of where I think our biggest like hopeful content is like saying how important it is for you to know more about your local biodiversity, because then you could probably really influence how fast the data can get spread, and also the kind of efforts that we're able to implement within local communities. But also b, you can seriously like almost like do science, or I mean, it is citizen science, but you can like partake in science yourself without even knowing it, and also without having to do much of anything.
Yeah, and I know we touched on that on a really early episode of ours. So if you haven't seen it, go check it out. But we talked about how important citizen science can be. We talked about specifically with mapping, but definitely with the example you used as well. And going along with communities and their conservation efforts, um, it can be kind of difficult sometimes if a community does not have the access to these resources to uphold the conservation efforts long term. It can be difficult because even if, a scientist or a government program comes in and says, "Hey, we're here to help conserve your wildlife," and they, talk to each other, whatever, the community may not even be able to focus on that because they're focused on other needs, maybe their homelessness or they have a food crisis or they're in the middle of a drought. I mean, there's a plethora of things that could be standing in the way of their personal needs, so they don't really have the energy to focus on wildlife needs at the time, which is environmental justice at its finest. I hope and wish every day that everyone can have their basic needs so that way they can focus on themselves and we can have happier people and we can have happier animals, a happier planet just in general. But yeah, that's definitely an important aspect too.
Yeah. In fact, like I guess like wildlife conflict itself is such a I keep losing my words because I want to say one thing, but then like it doesn't give it the emphasis that I really want it to. But like just how important it is in the grand scheme of things. So, like, say they did have a lot more socioeconomic issues to focus on, these other things are being degraded faster at a faster rate than, in my opinion, than the issues that they're probably focusing on. So it's also a matter of like priorities and also having more eyes and ears and just passion on the subject. Because one of the big things that we keep tying back to, and that's the whole point of this podcast, is talk about climate change. And human wildlife conflicts are one of the biggest amplifiers or have the biggest amplification from climate change, considering we're so important in understanding our like influence on the environment. And that goes past the people who don't really believe in climate change because it happens and it can impact resource availability. It can impact behaviors among species, but it also can, like we were talking about at the very beginning, influence the amount and the frequency in which we are interacting with our local wildlife. So back in the day when the climate wasn't as hot, I don't think there was as many, like, there were definitely cities, because cities has a big influence on human wildlife contact, but there wasn't as many. So, because the population size was a lot smaller amongst humans, and this problem didn't seem to be as important. So these other issues that you were talking about earlier, as far as like homelessness and even like food scarcity, all of these things are like they were the forefront of focus. And like we were mentioning, it means everything else kind of gets put on the back burner, which is not good because now we're like, hold up, we've got to fix this and fix it soon. Because there was a study by Shell et al. That found the intensity of conflict management varies amongst like policies, religion and culture, beliefs, and also public perception. And especially in today's society, it's such a like unnecessary controversial concept of how we're impacting our environment, how it's changing first off, but then how that's impacting like wildlife in of itself. And I did see like kind of bringing back the indigenous communities and like local communities. There was a study that showed that there's a positive relationship between power amongst like or shared power between indigenous people and local communities when it came to positive innovative methods to natural resources management. So that could suggest that rather than like thinking, oh my God, well, this problem has always existed, so it's always going to exist, then putting that like kind of negative connotation towards how how can we communicate better to fix this issue, which is the whole thing into why human dimensions is such a powerful perspective in wildlife conservation.
Absolutely. You bring up so many great points with that. And especially with indigenous knowledge, I mean, indigenous people's knowledge of the land and of wildlife is incredible. And indigenous people bring so much knowledge to the table that we may not know of, as a non-indigenous person. And I think it's really important that they have a seat at the table as well when it comes to environmental issues because of their deep ancestral knowledge of the land. And I want to go back to like community efforts as well. I know we've kind of been tying it in this entire episode, but as I was doing my research, I wanted to bring up a success story kind of towards the end of the episode, get past our doom and gloom of the episode as usual, and end out with something on a bit of a positive note. So there's a city called Millbank in Jamaica, and in the 80s, they have, well, there's a species of butterfly there, the giant swallowtail, that is it was being traded and sold across even to uh Orlando was where I read was where people were kind of trading them and sending them back and forth. So it was kind of a really unethical thing to do. They were just kind of collecting them and not really thinking much of it. They didn't think too much about the actual species itself, collecting, selling, trading them, etc. But as this went on, they people started realizing they're like, this is kind of maybe we should do something about this. So some scientists and their government stepped in and they updated their wildlife act. They already had an act in place that protected some wildlife, but in the late 80s, early 90s, they updated it to include these giant swallowtails because they were not included before. And yeah, ever since then, they've kind of been working closely with this rural community to just enhance their understanding of what they have where they are of their local species. And I thought that was really beautiful. That was so cool how they had a problem and it was identified and it was able to be kind of fixed through collaboration and they were able to conserve the species better. So
Yeah, that's an awesome example. And it just shows not even like, I guess maybe it wasn't easy because we don't really know exactly all the efforts that went in the back burner of it, but like it it shows just how vital, but also how like quick that we can fix things if we all work together on that issue. Which I know you were talking about like all the doom and gloom, and technically, like while it feels like the conflicts outweighs the solutions, remember there's always something that we can do. And we've given plenty of examples in this episode alone for ways that conservationists are working with local communities to try to fix problems, but also like together we can just find ways to peacefully coexist without any like social issues. And the fact that it's even we're making a social issue out of it amongst like different politics and other stressors that go into environmental regulation, like that just shows that people just don't understand. Because if they did understand, like the one that you were just mentioning, like that could happen for tons of endangered species or tons of different species that are vulnerable and in vulnerable communities now that we're moving in on them. So at the end of the day, we always like to be painfully optimistic. So there's tons of ways that we can help. It is not all doom and gloom.
yes, it's never all doom and gloom. There's always something that you can do to protect your environment, especially locally. So that's all from us. Keep pulling on the green thread, call your local representatives, ask your local DNR office about your local species, and yeah, let's continue the conversation.